ever get hit by like a wave of emotion completely out of nowhere? Like maybe a song comes on and suddenly you're transported back to a specific time or a certain place, and all those feelings come rushing back.
It really is incredible how potent music can be. It's like a
Right.
direct line to our emotional, like a shortcut.
Totally. And in Murakami's Norwegian Wood, that trigger is, of course, the Beatles song itself. It's like this key that unlocks all the protagonist's memories and pulls us along into this story of love and loss and, just self-discovery, but set against the backdrop of 1960s Japan. But before we get too deep into it all, I'm just curious because we know Murakami himself kind of came to age during this era. How much does that history, that time period, bleed into the actual novel?
Oh, it's definitely key to the whole thing. I mean, you have to remember that Japan in the 1960s, it was a society kind of in flux, right? It was the post-war years. And with that came all this rapid change. There were cultural shifts happening and, the student movements were going on. So there's this feeling of disillusionment, but also this yearning for something new. And Murakami really does a great job subtly weaving that whole atmosphere into the novel itself. I mean, it's more than just a setting. It almost becomes a character, don't you think?
100%. You can practically feel the energy of Tokyo. Like, as soon as we're introduced to our protagonist arriving in the city for the first time, he's trying to find his place in this brand new world. And get this, we never even learned his name. What's up with that?
I've always thought that was Murakami's way of inviting the readers, us, to step into the protagonist's shoes. It's like we're right there with him, experiencing the awe and even the alienation of Tokyo, just seeing everything with fresh eyes.
Yeah. Such a cool way to pull the reader in. And speaking of interesting characters, then we meet this guy, Stormtrooper, the protagonist, doormate. Okay, I got to ask you about this guy, especially this one detail that just cracked me up. The guy has this meticulous daily routine, like everything is planned out, paired with this stutter that only seems to come out when he says the word map, like classic Murakami, right? But is there a deeper meaning there? What's he getting at?
Oh, totally. It's definitely funny on the surface, right? But when you look closer, it just speaks to how good Murakami is at using these little absurdities, these quirks, to highlight something much bigger in this case, the inherent strangeness and sometimes the utter failure of communication in our lives. And Stormtroopers, I mean, even with how meticulous he is, he still struggles to really connect with people, which I think really speaks to the protagonist's own journey throughout the whole novel.
Wow. I never thought of it like that. Okay, so we've got this lonely protagonist trying to find his footing in Tokyo, this backdrop of constant change and uncertainty. It almost feels like Murakami is setting the stage for some pretty intense relationships.
Right. And that's where we meet Kazuki and Naoko, who form this fascinating triangle with the protagonist. And it kind of begs the question, can we ever really truly know another person, even in our closest relationships? I feel like that's something that really permeates this whole section of the book.
And that is the perfect transition to part 2. This triangle is about to get very interesting, and we'll dive into all those complexities right after this break. So we left off with this kind of strange triangle forming between the protagonist, Kazuki, and Naoko. And it seems like they've got this real bond between them, but there's also this underlying tension, Like there are all these unspoken words just hanging in the air. I don't know, what did you pick up on with their whole dynamic?
Well, what I find fascinating is how easily they seem to connect when all three of them are together, right? Like the conversation flows, they're sharing jokes, there's this genuine warmth. But then when Kazuki isn't around, it's like something changes.
Totally.
Like suddenly Naoko and the protagonist, they're speaking different languages.
Yes. It's like this layer of understanding just vanishes.
Exactly.
And do you think that ties back into that whole theme of communication we were talking about earlier?
Absolutely. Murakami uses this love triangle to really dig into the complexities of intimacy, but also isolation. And it's interesting because this happens even within these relationships that we assume are close and connected. And I think Naoko especially, it's like she exists in this bubble with Kazuki. And so when he's not there, she really struggles to bridge that gap with the protagonist.
Yeah, it's tough to read. It really is. And then just as we're kind of settling into this whole dynamic, tragedy strikes, this peaceful period kind of takes this dark turn, and it really forces us to confront this question that I feel like haunts the entire novel. How are we supposed to cope when we experience the sudden loss of someone we love? And Kazuki's suicide, I mean, it's a turning point for everyone, but it really hits Naoko the hardest. So what do you think Murakami is trying to say about grief here?
He's not really giving us any easy answers, that's for sure. Murakami's not afraid to show just how raw grief can be. Like, it can completely consume you, and if you think about it, notice how Naoko's speech, it actually becomes even more fragmented after Kazuki dies.
Yeah.
And her silences are even more profound. It's like a part of her is just gone. And now she has to figure out how to navigate this new reality where words can't even begin to express the depth of her pain.
It's like she retreats even further inward,
Yeah.
which is such a stark contrast to Midori when she's introduced, because Midori just bursts onto the scene,
Right.
challenging all the norms. I don't know, I found myself really drawn to her, almost like she was this counterbalance to all of Naoko's sorrow. What about you? What do you think Midori's role is?
She really is like a breath of fresh air, isn't she? And it's interesting because I see Naoko as kind of embodying this fragile beauty. Like she's always on the verge of breaking. Whereas Midori, she's all sharp edges, you know?
Right.
She's got this defiant spirit. And yeah, she's been through her own stuff too, especially with her family, but she seems to confront it head on, almost using humor and mischief as this kind of armor.
And it's within that contrast, the fragility of Naoko and then that vitality of Midori, that our protagonist finds himself completely torn. Is he looking for solace in Naoko's grief, or is he drawn to this life force that Midori has? It's messy.
And complicated, just
Like-
for real life.
Exactly. And that's what Murakami captures so well. All those messy complexities of love and attraction, how much our past experiences weigh on us. You know, here's this guy who's just trying to figure out his feelings for these two very different women, all while still carrying the weight of Kizuki's memory. This is where it gets really interesting for me. There's this one scene, it's the protagonist's 20th birthday, and he shares this incredibly intimate moment with Naoko, right? Like it's full of longing, all these unspoken emotions, but afterward, he's just consumed by guilt. What do you think is going on there?
I think that scene, more than any other, really gets at the heart of this section. Can we ever really separate love and grief? I mean, is the protagonist's connection with Naoko clouded by these lingering feelings he still has for Kizuki? We don't know. Murakami never really tells us, but he does such a good job of portraying the confusion, the guilt that can come when we're dealing with such intense and overlapping emotions.
And if all that wasn't enough, Naoko's really struggling internally, and her struggles just continue to kind of escalate. She eventually makes the decision to go to a sanatorium to get treatment, and that's a whole other layer to this story. Mental health and the search for healing.
And the sanatorium itself almost becomes its own character.
Yes.
It's like this tiny little microcosm of society where everyone is grappling with their own issues, their own demons, seeking refuge, and just trying to figure out how to be whole again. And that's where we meet Reiko, who's Naoko's roommate. And she adds this whole other fascinating dimension to how mental well-being is explored.
Oh, Reiko is such an important character, and I feel like her introduction really marks a turning point in the story. We're going to delve even deeper into the sanatorium and Reiko's wisdom and the really big turn of events that happens there in part 3. We left off with Naoko at the sanatorium trying to find some peace, and I have to say, bringing in Reiko, her roommate, really changed the whole feeling of the story for me. She's like this calming presence, you know, wise and insightful, almost like she's there to guide both Naoko and even the protagonist. What did you think about her role in this whole section?
Reiko is such an interesting character, isn't she? She's a survivor, that's for sure. Like, she's carrying around her own baggage, her own past traumas, but she still has this amazing ability to bring in perspective, even humor, when things are tough. And if you really pay attention, she becomes this confidante for both Naoko and the protagonist. It's like she helps them put words to things they can't even articulate themselves.
Exactly. It's like she creates this space where they can be vulnerable and honest, which is so important, especially in a place like that, the sanatorium.
Yeah.
But even with Reiko's guidance, there's this other heartbreaking turn, you know. We already know that Naoko is fighting these internal battles, and then, well, tragedy strikes again. How does Murakami deal with this second loss, especially so soon after Kizuki?
I think it shows just how skilled Murakami is as a writer that he doesn't shy away from the reality of mental illness. Like, Naoko's suicide isn't romanticized or anything. It's a very real reminder that healing isn't a straight line. And even when we try our best, sometimes the darkness wins. And the impact it has on the protagonist, I mean, it's huge. And it forces him and even us as readers to deal with the rawness of grief all over again.
It's devastating. There's no other way to put it. And it's even more powerful because we've experienced Naoko's struggles right alongside her. It is interesting, though, because Reiko, who has dealt with her own losses, seems to offer this little bit of hope in the aftermath. I don't know if you agree, but her visit to see the protagonist in Tokyo is one of the most powerful parts of the book for me.
I completely agree. That scene always sticks with me. Reiko, in her own way, is healing too, and she chooses to come back to the world, to life. She brings Sayoko's memory with her, of course, but she also recognizes that she has to move forward. And when she talks to the protagonist, she shares those really personal details about Naoko's last days. But it's not to hurt him. It's more like she's honoring Naoko's life and trying to find a way to let go. It's such a beautiful and heartbreaking way of showing how we carry on with grief, like how do we keep living when it feels like everything's been ripped away?
You said it perfectly. It's the kind of scene that just stays with you. And speaking of endings, Murakami leaves us with this last scene that's so open-ended, it really makes you think. Like the protagonist calls Midori, but we don't know what happens, do we? It's like he's just left hanging, and we are too. What do you make of that final phone call?
That's Murakami for you. He's not going to tie everything up in a neat little bow. Instead, he wants us to sit with that uncertainty. Does connecting with Midori bring the protagonist peace? Does he even know what he wants at that point? I think it speaks to the fact that life is messy, and sometimes, even after loss, we end up with more questions than answers. And sometimes, maybe that's okay.
It definitely makes you think, and there's so much room to reflect. I think back to what Murakami seems to be asking throughout the entire novel. What does being happy even mean in a world where joy and sorrow are always intertwined?
That's what I love about Norwegian Wood. It stays with you long after you've finished it, and it makes you think about your own life. Like, how do we define happiness? What is love? How do we deal with loss? Murakami doesn't give us the answers, but he does remind us that even when things are heartbreaking, we can still find beauty in everyday moments, in the connections we make with each other, and in how powerful memory can be.
That was perfect. And sometimes that's really all we need. A story that makes us feel, that makes us think, and that stays with us. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive. It's been incredible to explore the emotional world of Norwegian Wood together.